Now, we've all dealt with messy breakups before, right? But none to this level. So this is Alexis Maki. She shook up cocktails as a mixologist at a local speakeasy called Grit and Tonic. And on top of that, she was going to school to study radiology. She seemed like the typical 20-something. Loved ones say she had a passion for traveling, gaming. She was a proud pet parent to 2 adorable kitties and a dog. From reading about her, you could feel the love people had for her. Then something horrible happened. I'm Elizabeth Millner with Law&Crime. Alexis Maki was killed after being shot multiple times by her ex-boyfriend. I'm not saying allegedly here because he did plead guilty to what he had did. However, it was the hours leading up to the shooting that have some wondering, could this have been prevented? It was the night of November 4th of 2023 when a 911 call was placed. The caller said, "I'm at the police station. I effed up. I did something so bad. I shot my girlfriend. I need to be arrested, please." The caller was asked how many times she was shot, and the caller replied once. That caller was a then 25-year-old Emmett Metzger. But there's a problem with that statement. Like, 1, Alexis wasn't his girlfriend at that point. They broke up weeks before the shooting. And 2, she was shot multiple times, not just once. But he was right about one thing. He did F up because Alexis lost her life. So here's what police say happened. After they got the 911 call, they responded to Alexis's apartment, which she had shared with her ex. Police found her body with multiple gunshot wounds, like gunshot wounds to her shoulder, her chest, her hip, and even her neck. But Emmett initially claimed to police that he had just dropped the gun on the floor, and that's when he ran to call 911. Neighbors described what they heard to local news stations. For example, one neighbor said he was eating dinner when suddenly he heard gunshots and the smoke detectors went off inside the apartment. He explained he could hear yelling and was startled by the sounds of bullets ringing out. Alexis's mom told First Alert 4 last year that she had no idea what Emmett was capable of. Now, like I said, Emmett and Alexis had been broken up for weeks, about a month, but Alexis's mom told the news station he was very jealous, especially when Alexis wouldn't spend all her time with him, and that he made her life miserable. Even leading up to the shooting, Alexis was staying at her mom's home just to get away from Emmett. She even brought her beloved dog over to her mom's house. But here's the thing. On the day of the shooting, Emmett asked Alexis to come over to their apartment that they shared, even using the pup seemingly as a ploy. Alexis's mom said Emmett convinced Alexis to bring the dog that they adopted together over to their apartment so he could see the pup one last time while he packed his belongings. Her mom said she didn't feel good about her daughter going over there. However, Alexis said he wasn't going to hurt her. But here's a good time to explain what happened hours before the shooting. Now, we don't know when Emmett called Alexis asking her to come back to their apartment. But hours before then, he viciously beat up one of her coworkers. Police got a call of an attack around 4:20 a.m. at Grit and Tonic where Alexis worked. Alexis and one of her coworkers had grown pretty close, and Emmett appeared not to like it at all. So he allegedly pulled up to her job and punched her coworker several times. Again, this is super early in the morning, and Emmett reportedly attacked her coworker to the point blood was dripping from his face. It was in Alexis's car, on her dress, and he was left with a chipped tooth. And here's why people have argued Alexis's murder could have been prevented. Her coworker was very clear to police that he wanted Emmett in jail. Police reportedly didn't continue their investigation until hours later, around 8:30 a.m. that morning, when her coworker's father showed up to the police station asking why Emmett wasn't behind bars. Police then left Emmett a voicemail. He called back an hour later and even scheduled a time to come into the police station for a recorded interview. That time was set for 6 p.m. that evening, but he never showed up. And obviously we know now he did end up going to the police station later that evening, but to turn himself in for shooting Alexis. Lebanon police responded in a statement about not arresting Emmett, writing, quote, "These were 2 separate incidents with a very tragic ending. Police departments handle battery, not assault cases on a daily basis, and many times the suspect isn't apprehended for days/weeks after the fact. So you are aware, in Illinois, even if the suspect was found, he would have been given a summons and released pending a court date. There is only one person to blame for the senseless murder of that young lady in New Baden, and that is the suspect. Suggesting anything else is ridiculous." Now, ultimately, Emmett was charged with first-degree murder, and fast forward to just this week, he pleaded guilty to Alexis's murder. Now, he wasn't sentenced just yet, but he's facing a lot of years behind bars. I'm joined by criminal defense attorney Safa Robinson-Ferrer. Safa, always great to see you, and thanks so much for joining me. First, I got to ask, what are your thoughts on this plea deal? Does it come as a shock to you at all?
Not a shock at all, especially considering that the defendant in this case was the one that called 911 and admitted to guilt in that 911 call. He also followed up in his interview with investigators essentially admitting to murdering his then girlfriend. So this doesn't come as a shock or surprise. Um, he's taken responsibility. It avoids the need to go forward with a trial. I don't know if there's a sentence promise on the back end of this, but he's certainly looking at 45 years to life in prison. There could have been the conversation during negotiation that if you plea, we'll agree to a 45-year sentence as opposed to the life on the back end. But not a surprise here.
I want to thank Upside for sponsoring today's Law&Crime YouTube takeover. Upside is a free app that gets you real cash back on gas, groceries, and you can even use it at restaurants. It's super easy to use. Just claim an offer in the app, pay as usual using your card, and get paid. And it's actual real cash back too. You can use it Upside at places like Shell, Exxon, 7-Eleven, and even Chipotle. So to find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside, or scan the QR code on your screen, use our promo code LCTakeover, and get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Again, that's promo code LCTakeover for an extra 25 cents back on your first gallon of gas. And I want to go back to what you had just said about the 911 calls. Emmett Metzger said things along the lines of, I effed up, I did something so bad, I shot my girlfriend, I need to be arrested. As a criminal defense attorney, how common is it for defendants or even suspects at the time admitting to what they had done?
It's not as common as you would think. A lot of times, and in most cases, understandably so, if somebody commits a crime, they know the potential of going to prison. And so they try to hide that fact. Nobody wants to just get caught unless, you have some sort of remorse and you're like, listen, I messed up. I take responsibility. I killed my girlfriend and I'm willing to accept the consequences of that, which is what the defendant did here in this case. But it's not always common that we see our clients admitting to guilt, especially on a 911 call and especially on a murder case. So this case is rather unique, although we have been seeing more and more cases where there is a domestic violence attack and homicide, and then one of the individuals is calling 911, which makes me question essentially also what was the condition of that person's mentality at the time that the offense took place and at the time of the 911 call.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that just in a second, but I do want to get your opinion on him just kind of walking into the police station and turning himself in. Do you think it was because he was remorseful, or do you think he was more scared of how police possibly could have responded to the situation?
I think the likelihood is that he was scared of how the police could have responded to the situation. He at the point where he came out of whatever mental state he was in at the time of the homicide and reflected on what he had just done rather than run or flee or have to figure those things out. It seems like, again, he took responsibility for it. And it sounds to me, and I kind of get the feeling here that he wanted to avoid, getting caught out there by law enforcement, the surprise of police, and the things that come with being on the run from law enforcement. And so in order to avoid that, turning himself in, I think it more than likely would have been wanting to avoid, whatever consequences could have come from, unplanned police contact and things of that nature.
Right, because here at Law and Crime, we've seen it turn in all different ways. We've seen people turn themselves in. We see people run from law enforcement. We see people leave the country. We've just seen essentially it all here. And just the nature of the shooting overall is pretty horrific. He shot Alexis multiple times. She had gunshot wounds to her neck, her chest, her shoulder, her hip. What are your thoughts on just the level of violence he used against someone he supposedly loved? But then at the same time, he told police initially that the gun dropped and it went off, and that's when he called 911.
The level of violence here is indicative of a common pattern of domestic violence, which ultimately led to the death of this young woman. This is not a single gunshot wound that went off by mistake. This is more than one gunshot wound. And what people often don't think about or may think about is when you fire a gun, you have to apply a certain amount of pressure for that gun to go off. And so he did that multiple times. And so with that being said, I don't know what occurred prior to that taking place. I think there was a dispute at this young woman's job. But this was very intentional. This was set out to be something in response to this domestic violence situation that had been ongoing prior to this final incident that took place. Oftentimes, too, we also see a lot of stabbings, but crimes like this, especially when it's close range, when it's multiple gunshot wounds or multiple stab wounds, it really also indicates, the passion behind that person's act and the situation that was also occurring at that time. Not to say that it is necessarily a crime of passion, but with domestic violence cases, we see a heightened level of emotion with defendants. And so ultimately, these things do happen.
And it's just horrible as well too. And even speaking off domestic violence cases just in general, there seems to be kind of sometimes in a way just this interpretation that sometimes it's just a lover spat. But really, given what we do here and given the discussions we've had on so many other cases, that domestic violence cases in particular can always go wrong. And by wrong, I mean they can always end up and result in shooting, stabbing, other just harmful acts of violence. But what are your thoughts overall on just domestic violence cases? And to your point, just how, I hate to use the word passionate, but in terms of just overall the level of just intensity, that's the word I'm looking for, in overall with these types of cases.
So I'm a former domestic violence prosecutor in a special victims unit. And what I can always say is if there's ever a situation between two individuals where it gets physical, get out. Get out, whether it's a push, a slap, a punch, whatever it is, get out because these things only escalate. It is never going to be the one time. And you don't want to end up in a situation where you've been on the receiving end of violence and then you finally defend yourself, you kill that person, and now you're facing a murder charge. When had you had left before, you wouldn't be in that situation. Not only that, but you don't want to be in a situation where you think that you can get physical with somebody and ultimately kill them, and now you're looking at a murder charge. So it's never good, it's never okay. These things only escalate. As a defense attorney, as a former prosecutor, I will always say if there has ever been an incident of domestic violence whatsoever, leave, save yourself the trouble of death, becoming a defendant, harming your family or your loved ones or anything of that nature.
Yeah, and it's just heartbreaking overall because despite what Emmett told police, they weren't even together at the time that this had happened. They had been broken up for weeks at that point. And so it's just heartbreaking overall because she did all the right things. Alexis didn't deserve what had happened to her. And I want to go back to a point you were talking about as far as the defendant's state of mind around the time of the shooting, because we're talking about just what had happened hours before that, that being the assault that happened on one of Alexis's coworkers in the parking lot of a bar that she had worked at. So again, this was 12 hours before the shooting, and some argue Alexis's murder could have even been prevented had police arrested him after the assault because the person who was assaulted wanted to press charges. But what are your thoughts, and do you think that the shooting could have been prevented?
I always think the shooting could have been prevented. If there was a situation that occurred prior to the shooting incident, specifically this workplace incident, the complaining witness or the victim in that case wanted to go forward. They called 911, she made a police report, or they made a police report and wanted to pursue charges. There is absolutely no reason, other than maybe the defendant wasn't there at the time and they needed to get a warrant for his arrest. But there's no reason why, if that person was cooperative, that law enforcement could not have made that arrest, provided there was sufficient probable cause to make that arrest, and he would have been taken into custody at some point. With cases that involved assault or physical altercations or domestic violence and things like that, a lot of states have a mandatory arrest provision. New York does have that. I'm not sure if Illinois does, but I believe they do. So it would have required the police to arrest this individual, which would have ultimately prevented the death of this young woman. And we've seen that a lot in cases as well. So we've got that Gabby Petito case that, there's a question about that as well. But absolutely, this could have most definitely been prevented.
Yeah, and I just can't emphasize enough just how heartbreaking this case is overall. And given the overwhelming amount of evidence, you have the assault, you have the shooting, do you think had this case even gone to trial that a jury would have just found him guilty anyway? And instead of going through all of the trial, which could have taken weeks or however long it may have been, do you think that's why they just went and pleaded guilty just to avoid all of that instead?
Yeah, I think that this individual, he seemed to immediately take responsibility for what had occurred by calling 911 and admitting that to the 911 dispatcher and to law enforcement. So I think he probably, I would guess he either A, just wanted to plead guilty, or B, there was some agreement that if the defendant pled guilty, then the prosecution will go along with a minimum sentence, which is 45 years. And the likelihood is this guy's never going to see the light of day again. So that one of those things likely would have happened.
Well, Safa Robinson-Ferrer, always love having you all on. Always love your insight into the cases that we cover. Before we sign you off, though, Emmett Metzger is set to be sentenced in June. What do you think the judge will hand to him as far as the sentence goes? Do you think it'll be the max, or do you think possibly a little more leniency?
I think that considering all the facts and circumstances, including what we heard occurred prior to this incident taking place, there's clearly a history of domestic violence and there's a pattern of violence. On behalf of this individual, I expect that he's going to get a life sentence on this.
And I guess we'll see how this all continues to unfold. This case has been going on for years at this point, and so I hope that Alexis's family will soon get justice. Safa, again, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Emmett Metzger's sentencing is scheduled for June 9th, and he's facing anywhere between 45 years to life in prison. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.